Hi, I'm here with Jason Yarde and myself. I'm Tom Haines. We're from the Ivors Academy. We're here talking today with James Brady, who was one of the composers who submitted a work for the New Music Forum call for large ensemble jazz compositions. So I thought it might be nice, James, if you could just tell us a bit about yourself before we get into the music.
Sure. I was born in London, and I've grown up, in and around the southeast. But my family are Irish, and I actually kind of think that's kind of significant for my compositional identity, actually, in that I've always I've always been someone who travels between different worlds, um, musically. I started off as a trumpet player, although I was writing pretty much as soon as I was playing. Um, and I went down the kind of classical route mainly, all the way up to my undergrads, which where I kind of focused on composition and academic music. But during my undergrads, I found I was playing more and more jazz, and I found that the language of the music that I wanted to create was moving more and more in that direction, and I wanted to take it a bit more seriously. I was lucky at the time in that there was a bunch of us at university at the same time who were all really into jazz, and a lot of them were more advanced than I was as players and improvisers. People like Alex Hitchcock and Liam Dunnicky and Misha Mulavabado we were all there at the same time.
Mhm.
So I learned a lot from them, and then a couple of years later, after shedding for a bit, I went to Guildhall to do the masters there, and that sort of ground really set my jazz language on a good framework. Uh, it's been a few years since then, and funnily enough, I find myself moving back towards classical music as a main source for my musical language, but coming at it having had that whole filter of working as an improviser, working as a jazz trumpet player, and writing stuff for big band and things like that. So I'm kind of sitting in between those two worlds and trying to find a way forward from there.
Yeah, but that's something I think that comes across in the music that you submitted for the call for scores. And it might be nice just to say that the piece we were going to chat about was Dark Man's.
Yeah.
Before we talk about that, it might just be interesting to find out how you knew about the call for scores, how it came about that you chose. She actually submitted two works, but how you
Yeah.
found out about it
Well,
and
I asked nicely and was told that two would be all right.
yeah,
um, yeah. I kind of keep an eye out for this sort of stuff
mm,
pretty frequently, especially more recently now that I'm spending a lot more of my time writing. So keeping an eye out for these things. I probably saw it on Twitter, to be honest. Um, and I wasn't aware of the call for scores in its original form before the lockdown.
okay,
Actually,
yeah,
it was only once it got turned into the digital thing that
yeah,
I was, well, to be honest, I was on Twitter a lot more at the start of lockdown than I was before.
Fair
I
enough,
was
yeah.
like, what's
yeah,
going on?
yeah,
So,
okay,
I'm pretty sure I saw it that way, and I thought, well, that's brilliant because you don't actually see that many opportunities to submit especially large format, especially as a composer. Like
yeah,
in jazz, the main paradigm is that of the performer so often, and like everyone writes, but actually for someone who is more of a composer than a performer, it's actually quite unusual to get an opportunity to just put that aspect forward. So I was really
yeah.
really happy about that.
Mm, cool. So, Dark Man's.
Mm.
Tell us a bit about this piece.
So the title is one word,
Hmm.
and it's the title of a 2007 book by um, Nicola Barker, and it's the term refers to like an old in English, well, not old English, but like 18th, 19th century English word for the nighttime, used by it's sort of a thieves' slang. And in the book, which is a really interesting book. It's about this kind of twilight existence between the real world and a kind of fantasy world, and it's set in Ashford in Kent, which I think is a sort of brilliant location for a sort of world between worlds. And it's not really based on any particular character in the book or aspect of the book. It's just I read this book years ago, and I was left with this kind of abiding sense of unease, an abiding sense of, I think that's maybe why she chose the title, I don't know, but because it's this kind of slightly uneasy, it's a place that is a good place to be if you've got something that you need to be there to do, but it's potentially a dangerous place to be for everybody else. And the music came before the title, and I thought that the piece had that sense of like being on edge, being uneasy. And that's why I sort of chose it, because it just occurred to me that that book had always stayed with me, and the title had always stayed with me. It doesn't refer to a person, it's nighttime as a concept that it refers to.
It's a very episodic piece in the space of under 7 minutes, you managed to get a lot of different kind of episodes and events going on. So bearing in mind that you wrote the piece before you titled it, so to speak, what were the other things that were kind of influencing you as you came to those posts?
I actually tend to come up with my titles after the fact more often than not, because my instinct is for writing is almost always a like musical language rather than external concepts. Not always, but most of the time. The music that this is based on, some of it dates back to 2007, when I was like leaving school, starting university, and I wrote I was working at the time with a composer whose name escapes me actually, and a couple of other student composers. I can look it up. And we wrote some pieces for woodwind trio, for I think it's clarinet, oboe and bassoon, I think was the lineup. And all of quite a lot of the material in this version of the piece, or Darkman's, is based on that original piece. Few bits of it actually are almost like lifted directly. So that whole introductory passage, and the slower section towards the end as well, all of that's lifted from that trio. And what I added to it, it's a piece of music that I've always wanted to return to and kind of draw from, because I was really happy with it in a lot of aspects, but there were things about it I wanted to change. And so what I did is I took those two sections of it and I added the up-tempo swing section. That was new, as a third kind of colour to it, a third perspective, really. And I was actively setting out to write a piece which was episodic in nature and had more or less quick cuts, almost kind of cinematic style from section to section, because for years before that I'd really focused on writing pieces which were very organic in their development, and everything kind of smoothly transitions from one thing to another, and I was kind of a little bit frustrated with that, it was starting to feel like a limitation rather than a freedom. I just wanted to write something in reaction to that, so that's what I set out to do with this.
Can I jump in with another question here, Tom? Actually, I mean, you kind of answered a few of my questions, ironically, because I always find it's interesting if a composer has a favourite bit of the whole piece, And I don't know if that's necessarily the bit that you just explained that you borrowed from somewhere else. And also a question about economy of ideas, because you've talked about using material that you've had somewhere else, and even within the piece, it's quite interesting how certain ideas come back and return, or and how things develop. And also one instrumental note I find quite fascinating is you have this optional violin part.
Yeah.
And maybe you can talk about how that came about.
Yeah, so the violin part, there's two questions there really, wasn't there? There's economy and material, and then the violin part. I'll talk about the violin part first. So the violin part, entirely practical. So last year I set up a little kind of peer group for large format jazz composers with Tom Ridout, Maria Rahakova, and Charlie Bates. So we're all kind of similar age, and we wanted to do a sort of London Jazz Orchestra type thing, but more focused on our own generation. And we met a few times, obviously before lockdown, and one of the sessions we were going to play Darkman's in, and we had a guest composer coming in who's a friend of mine called John Garner, who's a violinist, and he was bringing a piece, and I wrote in a part for him, and we didn't actually play it. So the violin part's never been played, but I'd really like to hear it. And then to link back to your previous question, a lot of my pieces exist in multiple versions for multiple instruments. In fact, the same material I'm actually currently reworking again for a string quartet that I'm writing, because I just think it's interesting, and it's just interesting material. So in some ways I'm kind of lazy as a composer in that I write one good idea 13 years ago and I just keep rehashing it. But I kind of think of the process of composition is often like carving a statue out of a block of stone, in that you chip away and a figure emerges, but that's not necessarily the only version. You might chip away further and then a different one emerges, and you keep cutting away, and what started out as a man and a horse ends up as a bowl of fruit or something. So I like that unity of concept between pieces. And then within the piece, I come from that classical training, and it was kind of rammed home to me as a composer that there's got to be a balance between unity and economy of ideas and variety and development of ideas. So I just try, and that's the kind of craft aspect of working as a composer, is just trying to take preferably one thing and really stretch out the material as much as possible.
Yeah.
Nice.
And so you mentioned earlier about how you sometimes seem to sort of straddle these worlds of sort of jazz and classical. And I think when we get a chance to hear the piece, or other people get a chance to hear the piece, they will hear that. And I think how, in terms of the actual material for Darkman's, how do you think that is sort of, how have you kind of approached that in this piece, do you think?
So this opening section, with the brass and then the saxes, kind of just bubbling around this central note which shifts a little bit, that material all comes from the woodwind trio, and it's basically exploring the idea of heterophony, of the same idea happening simultaneously but slightly differently. And funnily enough, I now see that, even though that was conceived of as at a time when I was primarily interested in classical music, I now, the like most demonstrative example in music I know of that style of thinking is like New Orleans music, right? Where that's like, if I want to explain heterophony to someone, I just go like, listen to some second line, So a lot of times the idea is it really depends on the frame of reference, I think, as to what you're looking at. But this kind of idea of a little, maybe what's more classical is the idea of a little motivic device kind of gradually and organically evolving, as opposed to having a melody over some changes. There isn't the swing section from sort of letter C-ish, that is much more clearly jazz language, but even there, it's not really a melody over changes, because what it is it's a single line that I've conceived of, and then gone, all right, it's this triad, it's this triad, it's this triad, it's this triad, all over this pedal. So that sort of conventional sort of melodic harmonic language of the sort of chord mainstream standards tradition isn't really present in the piece, and instead there's a much more linear melodic motivic logic, which I find in the classical repertoire more frequently, albeit I'm not saying that it's never found in jazz at all.
Like less common, perhaps.
Yeah. Bob Brookmeyer is is a big influence for me in that regard. And then like the last section, again, this could be a sort of little study, a little kind of minor study for a piano or something. And so I've used the piano in that way. I've taken it out of the conventional rhythm section role, given it this written part. It's got like written in pedal use and stuff that you wouldn't conventionally find in your standard big band score, because it's just bringing in that different texture, that different approach to it.
Yeah, well, that's something that certainly kind of sort of jumped out at me is right. That sort of a nice combination, if you like, of non-standard sort of jazz sensibilities, but also some kind of framework where it still feels like it belongs in there. And I think that's a question I was going to ask earlier, actually. But when this piece was transformed, if you like, to being a big band arrangement, what was and there's a recording of it. How did the actual performance come about? Did you have was there an ensemble who was due to play it and that kind of thing?
So I had been talking to Scott Stroman of Guildhall and LJO for a while about getting a slot at the Vortex. Originally I thought I was going to do a warm-up set for the LJO, because I'd studied with Scott at the Guildhall and written a lot under him and so on, and I wanted more of a platform to show some original big band stuff, because I was doing quite a lot of arranging kind of for function, getting asked to do stuff and things like that, but I didn't. It's hard to get an opportunity to play original work of that scale, and then those conversations evolved into, let's do a big band festival at the Vortex, and then in the end, because David Mossman had just passed away, it ended up being a memorial to him when it happened in April 2019, and we did 2 days, and LJO played, my band played, Josephine Davies' band and Callum Gourlay's band played, so we had 4 over the weekend. And so I ended up getting 2 whole sets, or a long set. I can't remember whether we took a break now. And I sort of had enough music, but I wanted there to be something fresher and newer. And but I didn't have a lot of time, as you never do. And I had this old piece that I had sitting there for ages and was constantly like, I should write this. And it just occurred to me one day, it would sound really cool set in a big band, and it got written then really fast, which I quite often find happens. It's like a lot of the hard lifting, heavy lifting gets done before you start the piece, and then sometimes it just kind of occurs. And then the stuff where like the swing section came out like almost as an improvisation, because it's so much like part of the native language that I've picked up, that it's like playing your instrument. It's just you're playing it onto the score, and after that it's kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And so it was kind of my personal centerpiece to that gig, because it was the newest thing, the freshest thing in my mind. And then, like all these things, we had sort of 5 minutes to rehearse it, and and then play, which is always an interesting challenge, especially with, I've written a lot of music where the language of it isn't doesn't comfortably sit within one world.
Yeah.
And I find that that's the thing that for performers is most challenging. It's not the density or complexity of the changes or the number of notes. Does it sound like something that they are familiar with? And if not, it's going to be much harder to do.
Yeah.
And in a way,
I like to that.
Yeah. And so I've learned a lot about thinking about who you're writing for and intentionally writing in things that are going to suit them, even if there are other aspects of the piece which are really going to stretch them.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, that swing section gives the rhythm section the chance to just be a burning rhythm section,
mm-hmm.
because the rest of the time they're not going to get to do that. And if you want to engage them and like let them shine, you need to give them an opportunity to do so. So, that's what that's for, really.
Were you actually directing that recording? Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So it's a live performance of and me directing.
And you say it was your band. Is it that same band that came out of the collective idea? Was this a separate band?
No, this predates that, actually.
Okay.
And in a way, the collective, there's a lot of crossover.
Right.
But in a way, the collective was my reaction to doing that, because it's really expensive. And I lost a lot of money on that gig. It was worth doing, but I had a lean couple of months, and it's partly that it was two things. It was partly practical. It's really difficult to get that number of people together and respect them as professionals as well. I don't like asking people to do stuff for free, really, but also I did the gig, and it was like a summation of years and years and years of writing, and I packed everything in, and I put too much in the program, and it was a bit too long, and I got away with it. But afterwards, I was kind of like, do you know what? I don't really want to do another one of these straight away. I'd rather be part of a community that was like learning and from each other and feeding off each other and bringing different ideas to the table. It felt a little bit too egocentric. So I'd had my moment. It was time to, share the workload as well as the opportunity.
yeah, and the cost. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense.
I've got another question with regards to specifics of the piece. You talked about section C and the swing section, and one of my favourite moments of the piece is where that's interrupted right at the end of the tello. So you get this hint that something weird is going to happen. Just the trumpets start doing these very gestorial backings, and these glisses up and hits and what have you, and then all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, it goes into this free section.
Yeah, and
I love your direction to the tenor players. Blessed are the noisemakers, and also the language you use. This is one of the lessons that I learned very directly from one of my composition mentors, Colin Matthews.
Yeah.
And he said, basically, I was trying to explain how I wanted something to sound, and in very kind of layman's terms. And he was like, "Well, just write that."
Exactly.
And
yeah.
So you've got the horns wild in big capitals, and I just love that. That little bit of poetry to the tenor player is very suggestive.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's from a sort of influence point of view, the kind of the music of Don Ellis and Ornette Coleman and Lester Bowie and ASEM and stuff like that. It's all quite a big sort of inspiration for me. So the idea of and lots of orchestral music which has these big gestural things like Penderecki and Lutoslawski and composers of that sort of mid to late 20th century European language. And so like I'm very comfortable with going from a a sweet melody to a sort of punch in the face within the space of 2 bars. Like, it's great. And the question is Jason saying, like, how do you convey that on the page? That actually can be quite difficult because of the limits of the notation, and that's where just a bit of text like really helps. And I've written and seen loads of scores where it just suddenly says free, and like, what does that mean? It doesn't really mean, it can mean anything really. I mean, that by its very nature, what it tends to mean is everybody make a lot of noise at once, right? Which is maybe a good thing and maybe not so good a thing. Like, at this moment, that's definitely what I wanted. And so instead of writing free, yeah, as you say, write wild, and in caps. It's like, I actually remember writing this bit. I remember the physical feeling of notating this bit, and I was trying to, or inadvertently notating it with the same energy that I wanted it to be played with. It was like, right, one note, copy, paste, all the octaves, triple forte, type in wild, off we go. It's like that's that thing. And I mean, what's interesting about Blessed are the Noisemakers is we never had to rehearse that bit. All we did was just play it, and it was spot on. It was exactly how I wanted it.
So you feel kind of like a facilitator in that moment of this is the expression, and then, as you said, leave it to the guys to do their thing. Is a
facilitator is absolutely the right word. I mean, that's what I see myself primarily as being. Like, I'm not an auteur. I don't need to like specify. I actively don't want to specify every detail of a score. That's kind of part of the reason I got a little bit disenchanted with the straight contemporary classical world when I was younger, and it's also what I'm coming back to now as a composer. Is I'm trying to take a more rigorous approach to taking my hands off. So I'm trying to write music which draws out the personal musical language of the performers more, but not necessarily within the context of a jazz performance.
Yeah, that kind of brings on something that you've mentioned previously to us, is this compositional manifesto of sorts that you've mentioned, which sounds fascinating, and we perhaps haven't got time to go through it in massive amounts of detail, but obviously something that people can check out. But maybe just give us a little taster of that.
Broadly speaking, it comes down to the idea of something I call speaking musically, which is the closest thing that is familiar to us as jazz musicians is improvisation, right? But I don't use the term improvisation, especially because when you say that to people, they have a whole set of connotations. Like, a lot of musicians, you say improvisation, they instantly think of jazz. And I want to think about something a little bit broader than that. It's not tied to a specific set of musical language. It's the idea that you are speaking musically. In the same way, the metaphor I use is if you can have a conversation, then you're an improviser. Because when you talk to people, you deploy vocabulary, grammar, understanding of concepts, emotion, gesture, all of that material, and you do it without writing it down first or reading it out. And what I want to do is create the conditions for musicians of all types to do that. And my role as the composer is to facilitate that, to provide material which stimulates that, and increasingly to provide material which kind of scaffolds people towards that.
Yeah, so that sort of concept of ownership sort of becomes a little more sort of blurred, and sort of joint responsibility, if you like, to produce and create. Yeah,
exactly. I've always that concept of owning the piece has always sat weirdly with me. I've always felt a little bit disconnected once the piece exists. And it's like, my favourite reaction to a piece, my two favourite reactions are someone plays it and sends it back to you, and it's completely unrecognizable. And my other one is laughter. And occasionally you get both, and then it's like a really good day, you know. It's about that, just giving people that platform to express their own language musically, because everyone has it. It's just a lot of people just don't know how to use it. What I'm trying to do is I want to separate the specific content of my musical language from my utility and identity as a composer.